Hello, this is Faith at House Fraud Homestead, and this is the day I am finally making the diet journey video that I've been claiming I'm going to make one of these days for months. And before I get into all of this, I just want to give a disclaimer that I do not say diet with any intention of weight loss as a primary goal. And if you have any orthorexic, anorexic, bulimic tendencies, this is probably not going to be a video that's going to be beneficial to you, so I would click away. And also, I am not a doctor, I am not a medical professional, I am not a nutritionist. I have not read the books of the diets I am loosely following. So, all that is to say, I am speaking to my own experience and what I am doing to manage my own symptoms, and how I'm trying to eat in line with my values, for me. This is not an indictment of how anyone else eats. This is not a prescription for anyone to eat the way I'm eating. This is just kind of what I've settled out at and how I got there. So that's my cover your ass statement for that. So what I'm going to do in this video is basically just talk about what symptoms I've had over time, how I was eating at the time, and what I've done to mostly get rid of those symptoms pretty completely. So going back to childhood, I was fed pretty overall well, I thought. There was a lot of protein, a lot of vegetables. My mother was pretty carb phobic, so we didn't keep pasta in the house. We didn't have bread or anything like that, which, you know, not problematic in its own right, but that also left me with pretty severe carb and, oh, hi, Rudy. Pretty severe carb and sugar cravings that my other parents would sometimes indulge, and my mother's response to any of those, you know, impurities getting into her kid was, I believe, an overreaction. There'd be like mineral oil flushes and things like that. So needless to say, my gut microbiome was pretty screwed up in childhood by that point. I also have an ACEs score of something like 5, so, and my mother also has digestive symptoms. And also, on top of that, I would be shocked at this point if I were not somewhere on the autism spectrum. So all of those things point to some kind of gut microbiome adversity, even if that's not a causal factor. Those symptoms tend to be there. So I grew up with this fear of carbs. My mother also had some digestive symptoms where both of us actually would swell up like we were 6 months pregnant if we ate like a piece of French bread or something like that. So we would call them our bread babies. It was a whole thing, and it just became ingrained in my mind that, you know, bread equals bad, basically. And I would still, you know, if there was any kind of chocolate anywhere around or sugar, I was not moderate with it at all. So that kind of set up a pretty unhealthy pattern for me. When I moved out on my own, I'd lived with a partner for a while and was eating his diet, which was all carbs and all sugar, and that didn't go well either. I don't have memories of symptoms I had at that time, so I'm kind of skipping over that part of my history, but it did kind of make me aware that carbs aren't necessarily evil, because I do not recall having symptoms other than just swelling up pretty big. Not really indigestion or anything like that. I did have in college, I think they were stress related, these esophageal spasms where it felt like I was going to be sick when it was never fruitful. But I'd gone to a doctor for those, and he gave me Tums and sent me home, basically. So there was no resolution there other than not being in college anymore. So when I was living by myself finally, and I had total control over my own diet, I was trying to do, basic, the crunchy diet that crunchy people eat. So it was not totally vegetarian or vegan, but there was a lot of quinoa, there was a lot of raw vegetables, there was a lot of things that I had grown up basically thinking were very healthy for everybody. So a daily meal or a daily diet for me might look like breakfast quinoa with coconut oil and all of these like warming Ayurvedic spices and things like that, and a cup of coffee, and then a big salad for lunch with kale and spinach and all these things. Peppers, tomatoes, protein on there, and then I might batch cook some kind of like quinoa and protein casserole that I'd have a little bit of for dinner. And that was basically how I ate for several years. But after 3 or 4 years of what I thought was the perfect way to eat, I was getting these dizzy spells and feeling horrible after I ate. Like, I'd have to go to bed, or I'd spend half the day on the toilets, and it just became really untenable. I felt like my whole life force was being drained out my backside, literally and figuratively. And I was kind of baffled by this because I thought I was doing everything right. So when my now husband and I moved in together, he's a gym rat. I've said this. So he likes to eat a lot of lean protein, complex carbs, and low fat. And so I was like, whatever I'm doing is not working. Why don't you just make 2 portions of whatever you're eating so you can stay in control of your diet, and I'll just eat that. And we did that for a while, for probably the first 2 or 3 years we were together. And I still felt terrible. Though that diet kind of looks like I'd have a vegan protein shake thing in the morning, and then lunch would be like a meal prepped chicken thigh with a mountain of broccoli, and then we'd have some kind of sweet potatoes or steamed veggies and a lean protein for dinner. And I still felt terrible. And it got to a point where it became so untenable that I'd gotten into intermittent fasting for breakfast at least, because I learned that if I don't eat, I feel fine. So I had this brilliant window in the morning where I didn't eat and felt fine. But I knew that eventually I'd have to eat. And when I ate, I would be out of commission for like 4 hours. So at that point, I went to a functional medicine doctor. I'd gotten a little bit of a windfall so I could afford proper care. And from there, I gave my symptoms to this functional medicine guy, and he ran some tests. I think it was like an amino acid and urine test or something like that. And there was indications of insulin resistance, where I was not assimilating carbs properly, and also the potential for a couple gene mutations that might be impacting how I digest things as well. He did not focus as heavily on diagnoses so much as like healing underlying systems that are throwing things out of whack and bringing diagnoses on. So that's kind of the approach we took, to start with adrenal fatigue and go from there, basically. But one of the first things he prescribed me before he even had like a full plan for me was red meat. And by this point, we had been moving away from red meat in our house for a little bit then. Because we'd bought into red meat is bad for the environment, it's bad for you, and it's bad. So, but in this functional medicine doctor's opinion, the balance of fat and protein in red meat is very suitable for healing. So I started having, instead of a chicken thigh, a hamburger patty basically for lunch. And that started to help. He also put me on a ton of supplements, one of which was basically like a um, guts. It's like an immunoglobulin supplement that like just lines your gut and makes it bulletproof from whatever you're eating. But he also took me off any sugar, any carbs, and by this point we were eating, whatever we wanted on weekends. And I did okay on weekends because a lot of the stuff was processed. But he was the first person I talked to who said, oh, yeah, if you're eating a ton of raw vegetables and seeds and nuts, those can be pretty undigestible for some people. So I'd been doing more cooked, lower, I guess, FODMAP, I guess. I don't know. I can't remember what it was. But I was avoiding cruciferous vegetables, which did give me symptoms, and kind of lowering the overall fiber content by cutting off skins and seeds and things like that. So a lot of zucchini, squash, things like that. And I was starting to do better. And I was about 6 months into this and feeling better than I had in a very long time when the program ran out and I got a splinter in my foot and I had to go on oral antibiotics. And that set me back not quite to square one, but to like square two. So that was disheartening because I realized, oh, I don't have this resource anymore that I used to patch me back up. And it can be undone with this one thing. So that's when, I can't remember how I discovered it, but I discovered the GAPS diet. And I didn't do it perfectly. I don't have the book. I haven't done it all the way through the way they tell you to for like 2 years. But for those who aren't familiar, it's the Gut and Psychology Protocol, which is meant to rebuild your gut health to reduce psychological and digestive symptoms over time. And eventually make it easier for you to digest just about anything. So I started doing bone broth and way cut back on vegetables for a little bit, and just anything I knew I could digest, that's what I focused on. And small amounts of like fermented vegetable brine, things like that, and I started to recover. And I got back to about where I had been in about 3 weeks without all of these supplements that this doctor had me on. And so that got me thinking, okay, maybe I can follow this to its natural conclusion. And that sort of leads to a Weston Price style diet. Now, I do not necessarily condone everything this Weston Price guy has to say. This guy was a dentist in the 30s who went to various indigenous tribes all over the world and looked at their teeth to determine their level of health and extrapolated the diet they must be eating for the level of health he assessed by their teeth. That's an oversimplification, but needless to say, some facets of the Weston Price diet get a little bit out there. I'll talk about that in a sec, but in that structure of eating, there's a lot of, protein still, a lot of animal fats, but also you're allowed to have grains and, seeds and legumes and things like that, but they tell you how to prepare them so they're more digestible. So by then I had started introducing dairy, and I found that if I fermented it, I could, digest that better. I was doing sourdough with einkorn flour, and I could digest that pretty well. And so it kind of opened up this world of there's no bad food. It's just preparation that's not ideal. And so for the and since then, I've been on antibiotics 2 more times for dental work and had the same thing where I'm kind of put back to square one, and I'm able to rebuild by starting with the broth and the fermented vegetables and working up a little bit from there to, more meats and easy to digest vegetables like sweet potatoes and squash and pumpkin, things like that. And I've found that I've been able to keep my blood sugar fairly stable by doing this. I had pretty horrible cystic acne even when I was going through the functional medicine program that it didn't clear up until I started eating this way. And I found that if I eat this way at home, then I can eat whatever I want on weekends, and I haven't had a blood pressure nightmare except when I'm coming off antibiotics. So that was pretty cool. The other thing I like about eating this way, you'll hear a lot of homesteader types talk about the Weston Price diet, or nourishing traditions is the other thing it's referred to, because it's very intuitive, I think, and very natural for homesteaders to adopt, because it is very pre-industrial agrarian. It's a lot of very classic, almost ancestral preparation techniques, and a high focus on quality. And that's where it can get controversial, because they preach animal fats and animal proteins, and most of them are also, like me, into regenerative agriculture, where you can get around some of the ethical conundrums of eating meats if you are giving back to the environments through the manure, and also treating them humanely and feeding them a diet that they're also biologically suited to. But that gets really expensive. If you're getting grass-fed local beef, or grass-fed local anything, pastured chicken, things like that, it gets pricey. And some of the local groups who adopt this lifestyle, it's a privileged position to come from. You have to have a lot of time to locally source things and a lot of money to get the best quality, which isn't necessarily accessible for everybody. But for my belief system and my lifestyle, I think this is kind of the way to go for me. I've been told that everyone can be vegan if you just, go very, very strict and rigid and things like that. So I have a friend who's doing vegan keto and doing great on it. I don't think that would work for me and for my personal values. A lot of how vegans get necessary nutrients is from processed sources, and I'm of the mind that the most sustainable thing you can do is get something that didn't have to travel very far. So for where I live, in a temperate mountain climate, that's not going to be a vegan diet. That's going to be a lot of animal sources, a lot of squash, things like that. And that's physically and mentally and spiritually sits best with me, personally. So I feel good devoting more of my money and time to doing my best to source these really high quality local meats. I'm also eating less meat overall because it's expensive. But I feel better knowing that my vitamins aren't coming from a bottle, and that I'm seeing where my food is coming from, and it's not this greenwashed thing to convince me that I'm doing right by myself and the planet, when how the proverbial vegan sausage is getting made is, in some cases, horrifying. I'm not going to get into that argument here. I'm not telling anyone not to be a vegan if it works for them. But this is what's worked for me. And I'm saying all this basically to give anyone who's having similar symptoms a direction to look into independently. I wish I knew how to edit. I'd make like a what I eat in a day kind of thing. I have something like that on my Facebook page. If you guys, I'll link it in the description. But there's also a lot of great YouTube channels that tell you how to do this the right way better than I can. But I'm overall, I'm just glad that I learned eventually that less meat and more vegetables is not necessarily the healthiest thing you can do when you have a compromised gut microbiome. And I'm firmly convinced that there's no one right way for every single human to eat. I think the right way to eat is what your values and your constitution and your budgets, all three can live with. And for me, that's as local as possible, high protein, a lot of ferments, and not being afraid of animal fats. And I will say, despite all these wonderful other symptoms, getting relieved that I've experienced, I am gaining weight. I also hit 30, which, that's kind of the beginning of the end for your metabolism, but um, I've it's not unhealthy yet. I mean, even if it looks that way to me, but that is an effect I've had, and I think it would be less so if I had trained myself to reduce my portion commensurately with the increased nutrition and increased fat, fundamentally. But I feel so much better that I'm okay going up a couple dress sizes. And I'm sure that if I really, really wanted to, I could do things differently to take that weight off. Something I have been experimenting with is water fasts and more passive ways of just not eating instead of exercising more. And that seems to be working better for me. I do that periodically. And I also still do intermittent fasting on a 16/8 schedule, except for weekends, to try and keep that a little more flexible. But I don't feel horrible after I eat anymore, so I don't have to avoid food. So yeah, that's kind of where I've ended up. I'm open to the possibility that this isn't perfect, but it's the best I've found for me personally, and I hope that I'm able to at least give you guys some ideas if you're having similar insulin resistance or hormonal acne or other eating with your values questions for yourself. So next steps from here, I guess not, next steps for me, not for you, hopefully. I want to see what my hormones are without a foreign object in my body as I've had for the last 10 years. So I think I'm to a point with my health, with my diet, with my symptoms that I can afford to see if I can heal my hormones independently. Because a lot of what I'm after is sovereignty from the medical institution. And not avoidance necessarily, but I would much prefer to be able to manage my own health independently. And so if I'm able to take this foreign object out and see how I do without it and try and heal myself, I think I have the building blocks in place to be in a better position to do that than I was a few years ago. So that's kind of the next step. But overall, Gaps and Weston Price style-ish diets have done really well for me. So that's all I have to say about that. This is, again, not an indictment of anyone who eats any other way, and not necessarily a glowing religious review of either of those diets. But I will leave some resources in the description for anyone who's interested, and if you have any questions, I'll try my best to answer. Yeah, thanks for your time and attention, and see you later.